Hey there! Tonight we're setting sail from the familiar shores of the present and drifting back through the mists of time to an era of longships and battle axes, of warriors who carved their names into history with blood and iron. This is the story of Ragnar Lothbrok, a figure so steeped in legend that scholars still debate whether he truly walked the earth, and of his sons, who most certainly did, and who brought kingdoms to their knees. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's strangely comforting to see who else is out there, drifting off to tales of ancient warriors. So dim the lights, let the stillness settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let's begin with a tale that spans the cold waters of Scandinavia, the green fields of England, the sun-baked shores of the Mediterranean, and every place in between where Vikings left their mark. Picture, if you will, the northern lands in the early 800s. Not the ordered, peaceful Scandinavia of today, but a realm of wooden halls and earthen fortresses, of fjords cutting deep into mountainous terrain like the scars of ancient gods. The air would have been thick with smoke from cooking fires, the sound of hammers on anvils, the lowing of cattle, and beneath it all, the ever-present whisper of the sea. This was the Viking Age, a period roughly spanning from 793 to 1066, though historians quibble about the exact dates, as historians tend to do. It was an era when Scandinavian seafarers, driven by a combination of population pressure, political upheaval, economic opportunity, and perhaps just the sheer love of adventure, began venturing far from their homelands. Some went east into what would become Russia. Others went west to Iceland, Greenland, and even North America. And many, many more went south to the rich kingdoms of Europe. England, Francia, the Mediterranean coast, all became acquainted with the longships appearing on their horizons. The Vikings came as traders sometimes, but more often as raiders. Monasteries, fat with accumulated wealth and poorly defended, made tempting targets. Towns and cities learned to fear the sight of dragon-proud ships. But we're not here tonight to discuss the Viking Age in general. We're here for one man, or perhaps the idea of one man, depending on how you view such things. We're here for Ragnar Lothbrok, who may have been a Danish king, a Norwegian jarl, a Swedish adventurer, or possibly an amalgamation of several legendary figures, rolled into one convenient narrative package by later storytellers. The problem, you see, is that Ragnar stands at the very edge of history, one foot in the realm of documented fact, and the other planted firmly in the world of saga and myth. The Vikings themselves didn't write much down, at least not in the 800s. They had runes, certainly, but these were used primarily for short inscriptions, not lengthy historical accounts. The sagas that preserve Ragnar's story were written down centuries later, in Iceland, long after anyone who might have known the historical Ragnar had turned to dust. So we're left with a fascinating puzzle. A figure mentioned in multiple sources from multiple cultures, all pointing to someone or someones who raided Francia, who attacked England, who may have died in a pit of snakes. But the details shift like sand, and separating the kernel of truth from the embellishment is the work of a lifetime for dedicated scholars. For our purposes tonight, we'll navigate both worlds. We'll explore the legendary Ragnar as he appears in the sagas, because these stories tell us something true even if they're not factually accurate. They tell us what the Vikings valued, what they feared, what they aspired to be. And we'll examine the historical evidence, such as it is, for a real Ragnar who may have inspired these tales. And most importantly, we'll meet his sons, who step more firmly into the light of history, whose names appear in contemporary chronicles, whose actions shape the map of Europe in ways that resonate even now. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's begin properly at the beginning, or at least as close to one as we can manage. Before we dive into the story itself, it's worth spending a moment understanding where this story comes from. History, after all, isn't just what happened, it's also the documents that preserve what happened, and those documents come with their own biases, limitations, and purposes. The primary sources for Ragnar's life are three works written in the 12th and 13th centuries, roughly 300 to 400 years after Ragnar supposedly lived. First, there's the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, or Ragnar's Saga Lodbruka in Old Norse. This is an Icelandic saga composed sometime in the 13th century. The Icelanders loved their sagas, these long prose narratives that blended history, genealogy, and heroic deeds into sprawling family epics. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok is one of the legendary sagas, which means it deals with events in the distant past and incorporates a healthy dose of the fantastical alongside the historical. In this saga, we meet Ragnar as a young man, follow his marriages, his conquests, and ultimately his death. It's detailed, dramatic, and full of the kind of speeches and interior thoughts that no historian could possibly know, which is a pretty good sign that we're dealing with literature as much as history. Second, there's the tale of Ragnar's sons, or Ragnarssonathatter. This is a shorter work, sometimes included as part of the larger saga tradition, that focuses on, well, exactly what it says in the title. It tells the story of what Ragnar's sons did after their father's death, particularly their invasion of England to avenge him. The tale gives us valuable information about Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Sigurd Snake-in-the-Eye, and their brothers, and it's in this work that we really see them come into their own as characters and historical figures. Third, and perhaps most interesting from a scholarly perspective, is the Gesta Danorum, or Deeds of the Danes, written by Saxo Grammaticus around 1200. Saxo was a Danish historian writing in Latin, and his work was an attempt to compile a comprehensive history of Denmark, from its legendary origins up to his own time. Saxo includes Ragnar in his history, but his version of events differs in some significant ways from the Icelandic sagas. For instance, it's in Saxo's work that we first meet Lagertha, the shield maiden who would become Ragnar's first wife in the popular imagination and in modern television adaptations. The Icelandic sagas don't mention her at all. They have Ragnar marrying Thora first, then Aslaug. So right away we can see how different traditions preserve different versions of the same basic story. Beyond these literary sources, we have a few tantalizing mentions in contemporary chronicles. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a collection of annals recording the history of the Anglo-Saxons, mentions Viking raids and leaders, and while it doesn't explicitly name Ragnar, it does mention events and people that might be connected to him. The Frankish annals of St. Bertin record a Viking leader named Reginherus, who attacked Paris in 845. Many scholars believe this might be Ragnar, or at least a person who inspired the Ragnar legend. The annals describe how this Viking leader sailed up the Seine with a fleet of ships, besieged Paris, and was only persuaded to leave when Charles the Bald paid him an enormous tribute of silver, something like £7,000 of the stuff. This is, incidentally, one of the earliest examples of what would become known as Danigeld, paying the Vikings to go away, which worked about as well as you might expect, which is to say it mostly encouraged them to come back for more. Irish annals also mention various Viking leaders and activities, and some scholars have attempted to connect entries there with Ragnar or his sons, particularly Ivar, who appears in Irish sources as Imar and seems to have been quite active around Dublin. So we have literary sources written centuries after the fact, and we have contemporary chronicles that might or might not be talking about our Ragnar. We have multiple cultures, multiple languages, multiple perspectives, all converging on the idea that there was this legendary Viking, this extraordinary figure, who raided far and wide and had equally extraordinary sons. It's a bit like trying to reconstruct a mosaic, when you have pieces from 3 different mosaics mixed together, some of them broken, some of them from something else entirely. You can make out a picture, but the details are fuzzy, and you're never quite sure which pieces truly belong. But that's the nature of history at this distance. We do the best we can with what we have. And what we have suggests that yes, there probably was a historical Ragnar, a Viking leader, or perhaps several Viking leaders whose exploits became amalgamated into a legendary figure. And we know with much more certainty that his sons, or the historical figures who became known as his sons, were very real indeed. According to the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, our hero was born to King Sigurd Ring, who ruled over Denmark and possibly parts of Sweden and Norway. The sagas aren't always clear on boundaries, which is understandable given that political borders in the Viking Age were fluid things, more about personal loyalty to a particular jarl or king than about fixed territorial lines. Sigurd Ring is himself a semi-legendary figure, said to have won the throne in a great battle called the Battle of Bravelia, where Scandinavian warriors gathered in such numbers that the field was carpeted with the fallen. Whether this battle actually happened is another question for the historians to debate over their morning coffee. In any case, Ragnar was supposedly born into power, the son of a king, destined for greatness from the start. The sagas describe him as handsome, larger than life in all the ways Viking sagas appreciated. He was big and fair to look upon, wise in counsel, good to his men but cruel to his enemies. In other words, exactly the kind of figure you'd want leading you into battle, assuming you were on his good side. But let's talk about that nickname, shall we? Lothbrok. Lothbrok in Old Norse, which translates roughly to hairy breeches or shaggy breeches. Not exactly the most intimidating epithet you could imagine, is it? You'd think a legendary Viking would have a nickname like Bloodaxe or Skullsplitter, something that struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. The story behind the name is actually one of the most famous elements of Ragnar's legend, and it involves a serpent, a woman, and a pair of very unusual trousers. According to the saga, there was a Swedish jarl named Herod who had a beautiful daughter named Thora. As was apparently common in these stories, Thora had a pet. Not a cat or a dog, mind you, but a small serpent, a lindworm. Herod had given it to her as a gift, placing it on a piece of gold because apparently Vikings didn't believe in gift wrapping, but they did believe in making things as heavy and valuable as possible. Now this serpent did what serpents in legends tend to do. It grew, and kept growing until it was enormous, coiling around Thora's dwelling, so large that its body made a complete ring around her house. It had also, according to the saga, become venomous and aggressive, which put a bit of a damper on anyone's romantic prospects with Thora. Her father promised her hand in marriage to anyone who could kill the beast, but so far, everyone who tried had become serpent food. Enter Ragnar, young, ambitious, and apparently unfazed by the idea of fighting a dragon-sized snake. But Ragnar was clever, you see. He didn't just rush in with sword flailing. Instead, he commissioned special clothing to protect himself from the serpent's venom. He had a shirt and trousers made from animal hide, but not just any hide. These were boiled in tar or pitch, creating a thick, shaggy, waterproof barrier. Dressed in these protective garments, Ragnar confronted the serpent. The beast spat venom at him, but the poison couldn't penetrate the hairy, tar-soaked clothing. Ragnar struck with his spear, piercing the serpent through and killing it, thus winning Thora's hand. From that day forward, he was known as Ragnar Lothbrok, Ragnar Hairy Breeches, a reminder of the day he outwitted a monster through clever preparation rather than just raw courage. It's a great story, full of the kind of symbolic elements that sagas loved. The hero proving himself worthy through a test, the clever solution to an impossible problem, the winning of a noble bride. Whether any of it actually happened is, well, let's just say the historical record is silent on the subject of giant serpents in 9th century Sweden. But the story tells us something true about how the Vikings viewed heroism. Yes, courage was important, but so was cunning. The best warriors weren't just strong, they were smart. They prepared, they planned, they found advantages where others saw only obstacles. Odin, the All-Father, the chief of the Norse gods, wasn't just a war god, he was also a god of wisdom, poetry, and magic. Intelligence was valued alongside strength. Ragnar, in his hairy breeches, embodied this ideal. He was the complete Viking hero. Brave, strong, handsome, wise, and clever. He was a figure who could stand alongside the heroes of older legends, a man worthy of comparison to Sigurd the Dragon Slayer or any of the other great figures from the mythic past. And he was just getting started. According to the sagas, Ragnar and Thora lived happily for a time. She bore him 2 sons, Eric and Agnar, who would grow up to be warriors themselves. But happiness in the sagas is always temporary. Thora, in the way of heroic women in these stories, died of an illness. The sagas don't dwell on it, they were more interested in battles and quests than in domestic life, but her death left Ragnar bereaved, and more importantly for the story, available for marriage again. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we talk about Ragnar's other wives and his famous sons, we should probably discuss what Ragnar actually did, the raids and conquests that made his name feared across Europe. Because whatever else Ragnar might have been, legendary figure or historical person, or some combination of the two, he was above all a Viking raider, and that meant ships, swords, and a willingness to sail into unknown waters in search of glory and gold. The Viking Age wasn't really about exploration for its own sake, though exploration certainly happened. It was about opportunity. The kingdoms of Christian Europe, particularly England and Francia, were wealthy, but often poorly defended, especially along the coasts and rivers. Monasteries in particular were tempting targets. They accumulated treasure. They were repositories of gold, silver, and valuable books, but they were inhabited by monks who had taken vows of non-violence. From a purely practical standpoint, if you were a Viking looking to acquire wealth quickly, monasteries were like unguarded treasure chests. The famous raid on Lindisfarne in 793, often cited as the beginning of the Viking Age, established a pattern: swift attacks, maximum plunder, quick retreat before any military force could respond. Ragnar, according to the sources, was a master of this type of warfare. He commanded fleets of longships, those marvelous vessels that were shallow-drafted enough to sail up rivers but seaworthy enough to cross the North Sea. A longship could carry maybe 30 to 60 warriors, and a fleet might have dozens of ships. Do the math and you're looking at a force of anywhere from 500 to 3,000 warriors appearing suddenly on your coastline, and by the time you'd gathered enough soldiers to oppose them, they were often already gone, their ships laden with plunder. The Frankish chronicles tell us about a Viking raid on Paris in 845, led by a chieftain named Ragnar. The chronicles describe how this leader sailed up the Seine with 120 ships, that's potentially 7,000 warriors, though these numbers were often exaggerated by chroniclers who wanted to emphasize the threat. When Ragnar reached Paris, he didn't immediately attack. Instead, he waited. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, tried to stop him by fortifying both banks of the Seine, but Ragnar outmaneuvered him. He attacked the smaller Frankish force on one side, decisively defeating them, and then hanged 111 Frankish prisoners within sight of Paris on an island in the river, possibly as a sacrifice to Odin. This act of psychological warfare, combined with the sheer size of his force, convinced Charles that direct combat was a bad idea. Instead, Charles paid Ragnar 7,000 pounds of silver to leave, which Ragnar graciously accepted, sailing away with an absolutely obscene amount of wealth, and not a single French arrow wound to show for it. Many scholars believe this Ragnar was either Ragnar Lothbrok, or at the very least inspired the Ragnar legend. The names are similar, Ragnar being a Latinized form that could easily be Ragnar. The tactics match what we know about Viking warfare: mobility, psychological warfare, pragmatism about when to fight and when to take the money and run. But here's the thing about identifying historical figures with legendary ones: it's rarely neat and tidy. There may have been multiple Viking leaders named Ragnar or variations thereof. It wasn't an uncommon name. The historical Ragnar who attacked Paris might have been one of them, or he might have been someone else entirely whose success became attributed to the legendary Ragnar in later retellings. The sagas, of course, give us a much more detailed account of Ragnar's raids. They tell us he raided widely across England, attacking monasteries and towns, always seeming to be one step ahead of the local defenders. They tell us he sailed to Ireland, to Francia, to the Baltic lands. Every coast, it seemed, knew his name. Some of these raids are corroborated by historical records, at least in general terms. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records numerous Viking raids during this period, and while it doesn't always name the leaders, the pattern of activity matches what the sagas describe. Ragnar was also, according to the sources, an innovator in siege warfare. Vikings typically avoided fortified positions, preferring targets that were easier to attack and loot. But Ragnar allegedly developed tactics for besieging towns, using his ships not just for transportation, but as mobile platforms for attack, blocking harbors, cutting off supplies, wearing down defenders until they surrendered or could be overwhelmed. What made him particularly dangerous wasn't just his willingness to fight, it was his strategic mind. He understood logistics, the importance of supply lines, the value of intelligence about enemy movements. He knew when to press an attack and when to accept payment and withdraw to fight another day. And he inspired tremendous loyalty in his men. Viking raids were cooperative ventures. Warriors followed leaders they believed would bring them victory and wealth. A successful raid meant shares of the plunder. An unsuccessful one meant death or return home empty-handed. Ragnar's repeated successes made him a magnet for warriors looking to make their fortune. Think about what that meant in practical terms. Every successful raid added to his legend, which attracted more warriors, which made the next raid more likely to succeed. It was a self-reinforcing cycle. Success bred success, and legend grew with each telling. By the time Ragnar was middle-aged, his reputation would have preceded him. When his ships appeared on the horizon, defenders knew they were facing not just a raider, but the Raider, a man whose name had become synonymous with Viking might. But even legendary warriors grow old, and even the most successful campaigns eventually come to an end. For Ragnar, that end would come not in glorious battle, but in a pit of serpents in Northumbria, betrayed by a king who saw an opportunity to rid himself of a dangerous enemy. But we're not there yet. Before we get to Ragnar's death, we need to talk about the women in his life, because they're not just romantic interests in this story. They're crucial to understanding Ragnar, and even more importantly, to understanding how his sons came to be. If Ragnar Lothbrok is a figure shrouded in legend, his wives are even more so. The sources disagree about how many wives he had, what order he married them in, and even what their names were. This is the nature of saga literature. Different storytellers emphasize different aspects of the tale, and as the stories were told and retold over generations, details shifted and changed. Let's start with Lagertha, because she's probably the most famous of Ragnar's wives, thanks in large part to her appearance in Saxo Grammaticus's Gesta Danorum and her prominent role in the television series Vikings. According to Saxo, writing around the year 1200, Lagertha was a shield maiden, a woman warrior who fought alongside men in battle. Now, shield maidens are a controversial topic among historians. Did they actually exist? We have references to them in sagas and legends, and Saxo treats Lagertha as a historical figure, but we have very little archaeological evidence for women warriors in Viking society. Recent discoveries have complicated this picture. There's a grave at Birka in Sweden, long assumed to contain a male warrior because of all the weapons and military equipment buried with the body that turned out, upon DNA analysis, to contain a woman. So maybe shield maidens did exist, at least occasionally. Or maybe this woman was buried with military honors for reasons other than combat. The debate continues. But in Saxo's account, there's no doubt, Lagertha was a warrior. He describes her as fighting in the front ranks with her hair flowing down her back, revealing her gender even as she fought as ferociously as any man. Ragnar, according to Saxo, encountered her when he came to avenge his grandfather, a Norwegian king who had been killed by Swedish invaders. Many of the women of the slain king's family had been forced into prostitution as a humiliation, but some of them, led by Lagertha, dressed in men's clothing and joined Ragnar's army. Lagertha's prowess in battle caught Ragnar's attention, and he became determined to marry her. But Lagertha, perhaps testing him or perhaps just being practical, set guards at her home, a bear and a great hound. Ragnar, never one to be deterred by dangerous animals, killed the bear with his spear and strangled the hound to death with his bare hands. Having proven himself worthy, he won Lagertha's hand. According to Saxo, they had a son, Fridleif, and 2 daughters whose names aren't preserved. The marriage lasted for a time, but eventually Ragnar divorced Lagertha to marry another woman, Thora. Saxo suggests Ragnar was still annoyed that Lagertha had set those animals on him, which seems like holding a grudge for a remarkably long time, but perhaps that's just how things worked in the 9th century. Interestingly, Lagertha makes only one more appearance in Ragnar's story. Years later, when Ragnar was fighting a civil war in Denmark, he sent to Norway for reinforcements, and Lagertha, still loyal to him despite the divorce, came to his aid with 120 ships. In the decisive battle, when Ragnar's forces were wavering, Lagertha led a flanking maneuver that turned the tide, winning the day for Ragnar. Having saved him, she then returned to Norway, and that's the last we hear of her in the historical sources. It's a wonderful story, full of drama and strong characters, and it tells us something about how the medieval Scandinavians and Danes thought about women and warfare. Lagertha is portrayed as every bit as capable as any male warrior. Her gender is noted, but not seen as a disqualification. She's clever, brave, and loyal. Exactly the kind of person you'd want on your side in a fight. But here's the thing, Lagertha doesn't appear in the Icelandic sagas at all. Not in the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, not in the tale of Ragnar's sons, nowhere. The Icelandic tradition has Ragnar marrying Thora first, then Aslaug. So either Saxo had access to traditions the Icelanders didn't, or he invented Lagertha, or there's some confusion about who was married to whom and when. Some scholars have suggested that Lagertha might be based on a Norse goddess, possibly Thorgerd Holgabrud, a figure associated with battle and protection. The story of her flying around to the rear of the enemy in battle has parallels with Valkyrie tales. It's possible that a real woman warrior's story became mingled with divine attributes over time, creating the figure we see in Saxo's work. For our purposes, what matters is that the tradition of Ragnar having a warrior wife, whether historical or legendary, tells us something about the cultural context of the Viking Age. Women in Norse society had more rights and independence than in many other European cultures of the time. They could own property, divorce their husbands, and in some cases, apparently, they could fight. Now let's move on to Thora Borgarhjort, the woman Ragnar married after killing the great serpent. We've already discussed how he won her hand by defeating the lindworm that guarded her dwelling. Thora was the daughter of Heraud, a Swedish jarl, which made her a woman of high status. The sagas tell us that Ragnar and Thora were happy together, at least for a while. They had two sons, Eric and Agnar, who would grow up to be warriors. Eric would eventually be killed in Sweden, and Agnar would meet a similar fate, their deaths prompting Ragnar's other sons, his sons with Aslaug, to seek revenge. But Thora's story is brief in the sagas. She's primarily important as the mother of Eric and Agnar, and as the woman whose death opened the door for Ragnar's third and most consequential marriage. She died of illness. The sagas don't elaborate on what kind, and Ragnar was left a widower for the second time. And this brings us to Aslaug, also known as Kraka, the woman who would bear Ragnar his most famous sons. Aslaug's backstory is pure saga material, the kind of thing that could only happen in legend. According to the Volsunga saga and the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, Aslaug was the daughter of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, the legendary hero who killed the dragon Fafnir, and Brynhild the Valkyrie. If you know your Wagner operas, you'll recognize these names from the Ring cycle. Now, chronologically speaking, this is impossible. Sigurd and Brynhild are figures from much older Germanic legend, associated with events centuries before Ragnar's time. But the sagas weren't concerned with chronological consistency. What mattered was the symbolic connection. By making Aslaug the daughter of these legendary heroes, the saga writers were elevating Ragnar's lineage, giving his sons a connection to the heroic age of the past. According to the story, Aslaug's parents died when she was very young, and she was hidden away by a foster father named Heimir to protect her from enemies. Heimir concealed her in a harp case and disguised himself as a beggar, traveling to Norway. Eventually, Heimir was murdered by a peasant couple, Grima and Aki, who discovered the girl and raised her as their own, giving her the name Kraka. Years later, Ragnar's men encountered this young woman while raiding along the Norwegian coast. They were struck by her beauty and intelligence, and word reached Ragnar. Intrigued, Ragnar sent for her. But being Ragnar, he couldn't just invite her normally. No, he sent a riddle. She was to come to him neither dressed nor undressed, neither hungry nor full, and neither alone nor in company. Aslaug, demonstrating the intelligence she inherited from her legendary parents, solved the riddle. She came wearing only a fishing net over her body, so she was neither fully dressed nor naked. She was eating an apple as she walked, so she was neither hungry nor full, and she brought a dog with her, so she was neither alone nor in company. Impressed by her cleverness, Ragnar proposed marriage. They married, and Aslaug began bearing him sons. Lots of sons. The exact number varies by source, but most accounts agree on at least 4. Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Hvitserk, and Sigurd Snake-in-the-Eye. Some versions add Uber and Ragnvald. These boys would grow up to be the most feared Viking warriors of their generation, but the most famous of these sons, at least in terms of the story, was Ivar, the eldest according to most sources, and his birth was surrounded by prophecy and warning. Aslaug, who possessed second sight, could see things others couldn't, warned Ragnar that if he consummated their marriage before a certain period of time had passed, their child would be born with a curse. The saga says he should wait 3 nights, but Ragnar, who had been away at war and hadn't seen his beautiful wife in some time, couldn't wait. He ignored her warning, and so Ivar was born without bones, or with bones so soft and weak that they couldn't support him. The exact nature of his condition is unclear. The Old Norse term used in the sagas is imprecise, but it's been speculated that he might have had osteogenesis imperfecta, brittle bone disease, or some other skeletal disorder. When Ivar was born, Ragnar was prepared to kill him, as was sometimes done with severely disabled infants in that harsh time. But Aslaug refused, and Ivar survived. Against all odds, he would grow up to be the most feared of Ragnar's sons, compensating for his physical limitations with a brilliant strategic mind and an absolutely ruthless approach to warfare. But we'll get to Ivar and his brothers in due course. First, we need to talk about how Ragnar's story ended, because it's one of the most famous deaths in Viking legend, and it set in motion everything that came after. Every hero's journey must end, and for Ragnar Lothbrok that end came in England, in the kingdom of Northumbria, at the hands of King Aella. According to the sagas, Ragnar's final raid was born of either hubris or grief, depending on which source you read. Some versions say he was trying to outdo his sons, who were becoming famous warriors in their own right and threatening to overshadow him. Others say he was avenging earlier defeats or trying to reclaim territory. The motivation matters less than what happened next. Ragnar sailed to England with only 2 ships. 2. After a lifetime of leading fleets of dozens or hundreds of vessels, he arrived with maybe 120 warriors total. The sagas present this as confidence, perhaps overconfidence. He was Ragnar Lothbrok, after all. He'd spent decades terrifying English kingdoms. 2 ships should be enough, they weren't. King Aella of Northumbria, who had been dealing with Viking raids for years, saw his opportunity. Ragnar's tiny force was overwhelmed. There are different accounts of exactly how the battle went, but the end result was the same. Ragnar was captured, alive, and Aella faced a decision about what to do with his famous prisoner. He could have executed Ragnar immediately, a quick death by sword or axe. He could have held him for ransom. Vikings were known to pay enormous sums to get their leaders back. He could have even freed him in exchange for a promise not to return, though given Ragnar's track record, that would have been optimistic at best. Instead, Aella chose torture. Specifically, he had a pit prepared, filled with venomous serpents, and he had Ragnar thrown into it. The symbolism here is rich, almost too rich. Ragnar, who won his nickname by killing a great serpent, who spent his life attacking Christian kingdoms, now dies surrounded by serpents, creatures associated with Satan in Christian iconography. It's poetic justice from Aella's perspective, the pagan Viking killed by the very creatures he'd once defeated. The sagas, particularly a poem called Krakumal or Kraka's Lay, give us Ragnar's final moments. As the serpents bit him, as the poison filled his veins, Ragnar didn't beg for mercy. Instead, he sang a death song, recounting his life's deeds, his battles, his victories. The poem has Ragnar boasting about the lands he'd conquered, the enemies he'd slain, the wealth he'd accumulated. And then, as death approached, he supposedly uttered the words that would echo down through history. How the little pigs would grunt if they knew what the old boar suffers. The little pigs were his sons, and Ragnar was right to think they'd be interested in news of his death. They would be very interested indeed. Now, did this actually happen? Did Ragnar Lothbrok really die in a snake pit in Northumbria? The evidence is mixed. There was certainly a King Aella of Northumbria in the mid-800s. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records him, and there were certainly Viking raids on Northumbria during this period. Whether there was a specific Viking leader named Ragnar who was captured and executed in this particular way, that's less clear. Some historians point out that snake pit executions weren't actually common in Anglo-Saxon England. It would have been a complex, unusual, and frankly impractical way to kill someone when a sword would do the job faster and cleaner. The story might be symbolic rather than literal, representing the triumph of Christianity over paganism, or it might be a later embellishment added to make the story more dramatic. What we do know with much more certainty is what happened next. Within a few years of whenever and however Ragnar died, a massive Viking army invaded England, led by warriors who called themselves the Sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. And that army would change the history of England forever. But before we get to that, let's take a moment to properly introduce these sons, these warriors, who would prove themselves worthy of their legendary father's name. Imagine being the son of Ragnar Lothbrok. Imagine growing up in the shadow of that legend, hearing stories about your father's exploits, seeing how warriors reacted when they learned whose boy you were. It would be a burden and an opportunity all at once. You'd have a reputation to live up to, certainly, but you'd also have something invaluable, a name that commanded respect and fear. Other warriors would follow you based on your father's legend. Kings and jarls would treat you carefully, knowing that you came from warrior stock. The sons of Ragnar, whether they were truly his biological children, or whether they claimed that lineage for political advantage, made the most of their inheritance. Each carved out his own legend, and together they became perhaps the most famous generation of Vikings in history. Let's meet them properly. First there's Ivar the Boneless, Ivar in Bainlausi in Old Norse. His very nickname is a puzzle historians are still debating. Was he literally boneless, suffering from some condition that left him unable to walk? Some sagas describe him being carried into battle on a shield. Or was boneless a metaphor, perhaps referring to his flexibility, his ability to adapt to any situation? Or, as some scholars have awkwardly suggested, was it referring to impotence, an inability to father children? The sagas emphasize his intelligence above all else. Ragnar himself is said to have remarked that of all his sons, Ivar had the keenest mind and was therefore the most dangerous. While his brothers were strong and skilled warriors, Ivar was the strategist, the planner, the one who saw 3 moves ahead. Then there's Bjorn Ironside, Bjorn Jarnside. The nickname tells you what you need to know. He was incredibly tough, as if his sides were made of iron. While Ivar plotted and schemed, Bjorn led from the front. He was the warrior's warrior, the one who sought glory in battle, and who would lead his men on one of the most audacious Viking expeditions ever attempted, a raid into the Mediterranean that would take him as far as North Africa and Italy. Sigurd Snake-in-the-Eye, Sigurd Ormari Auga, had the most distinctive physical characteristic of all the brothers. According to the sagas, he was born with a mark in his eye, the image of a serpent or a snake biting its own tail, the Ouroboros. This connected him symbolically to his father's serpent-slaying deed and marked him as special from birth. He would eventually become a king in his own right, ruling over parts of Denmark. Hvitserk, whose name means white shirt, is a more mysterious figure. Some scholars believe he's the same person as Halfdan Ragnarsson, that Hvitserk was a nickname for Halfdan. The sources are confusing on this point, with Norse sagas mentioning Hvitserk and Anglo-Saxon chronicles mentioning Halfdan, but rarely both in the same account. He was one of the leaders of the Great Heathen Army and would eventually rule parts of Northumbria. Ubi, or Uba in some sources, was another of the Great Heathen Army's commanders. He's mentioned in contemporary Anglo-Saxon chronicles, which makes him one of the most historically verified of Ragnar's sons. He would die in England, killed in battle against the Saxons. There are other sons mentioned in various sources. Eric and Agnar, the sons of Thora, who died young in Sweden. Ragnvald, possibly others. The exact number varies by source, as does the order of their births, and even which mother bore which son. The sagas sometimes contradict each other on these details, but what's consistent across all the sources is this. The sons of Ragnar Lothbrok were exceptional warriors who, together, would launch one of the largest and most successful Viking invasions in history. And it all started with a message from England, a message from King Aella's court, informing them that their father was dead. When news of Ragnar's death reached his sons, their reactions, according to the sagas, were telling of their characters. Bjorn Ironside gripped his spear so tightly that his handprint was left in the wood. Sigurd Snake-in-the-Eye was playing Tafel, a Viking board game with a knife in his hand. On hearing the news, he cut himself to the bone, not even seeming to notice the blood. Hvitserk was in the bath. The saga says he gripped his hair so hard that it came out by the roots. Ivar's reaction was the most controlled and, in its own way, the most frightening. His face showed nothing. No tears, no rage. He simply went white, and those who knew him knew this was when he was most dangerous. The brothers swore vengeance. This wasn't just about anger, though certainly there was anger. This was about honor, about duty. In Norse society, a son was obligated to avenge his father's death. To fail to do so was to be shamed, to be less than a man. The sons of Ragnar had no choice but to gather their warriors and sail for England. But this wouldn't be a simple raid. This would be an invasion. The army they gathered became known in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as the Heathen here, the Great Heathen Army, or sometimes just the Great Army. The size of this force is disputed, as is often the case with medieval numbers. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle claims it was so large, it covered the land like a swarm of locusts. But medieval chroniclers were notorious for exaggerating enemy numbers to make their own defeats seem more excusable or their victories more impressive. Modern estimates put the Great Heathen Army at somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 warriors, with some scholars suggesting it might have been larger. For context, this was huge by Viking Age standards. Most Viking raids involved a few hundred warriors at most. An army of several thousand was unprecedented, and the logistics of feeding, housing, and coordinating such a force would have been staggering. The army landed in East Anglia in 865. The year is reasonably well attested in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which gives us one of the few solid dates in this entire story. They arrived not as raiders, but as conquerors, and they were led, according to both Norse and English sources, by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. Ivar the Boneless is mentioned by name in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, appearing as Ingvar, or similar spellings, demonstrating that whatever else might be legendary about these figures, Ivar was definitely real and definitely leading this army. The East Anglians, wisely deciding that discretion was the better part of valor, made peace. They provided the Vikings with horses, a crucial advantage that would let the army move quickly across country rather than being limited to coastal raids. In exchange, the Vikings agreed not to ravage East Anglia, for now. Then the army moved north into Northumbria, and it's here that the story of vengeance reaches its climax. King Aella of Northumbria, the man who had killed Ragnar, was at war with another claimant to the throne, a man named Osbert. Northumbria was divided, weak, exactly the wrong state to be in when an enormous Viking army came calling. The Vikings took York, the old Roman city that the English called Eoforwic, and the Vikings would call Jorvik. The taking of York wasn't just a military victory, it was a symbolic one. York was the capital of Northumbria, its largest city, a center of trade and ecclesiastical power. Aella and Osbert, realizing the danger, put aside their quarrel and joined forces to retake the city. In March of 867, they attacked. The battle was fierce, fought in the streets of York, but the Vikings had the advantage of defensive positions and, more importantly, brilliant leadership. Ivar had planned well. Both Aella and Osbert were killed in the fighting, and here's where legend and history blur together once again. According to Norse tradition, Aella was captured alive, and the sons of Ragnar, particularly Ivar, subjected him to a form of execution called the Blood Eagle. The Blood Eagle is one of the most notorious elements of Viking legend. According to descriptions in the sagas, the victim's back was cut open, the ribs were severed from the spine and pulled outward like wings, and the lungs were pulled out, creating a grotesque image of an eagle. Salt was sometimes rubbed in the wounds. It was, by all accounts, an absolutely horrific way to die. Did it actually happen? Historians debate this. Some argue that the blood eagle is a misunderstanding of poetic language in the sagas, that phrases about cutting an eagle on someone's back were metaphorical, not literal. Others point out that Vikings did practice human sacrifice, particularly of high-status captives, and that the blood eagle might have been a ritual execution, a sacrifice to Odin. Whether Aella actually died via blood eagle or was simply killed in the fighting, the result was the same. Ragnar was avenged. The sons had fulfilled their filial duty. Honor was satisfied, but they didn't go home. They had an army, they had momentum, and England was rich and divided. Why stop now? The Great Heathen Army would continue campaigning in England for over a decade, conquering kingdoms, installing puppet rulers, and ultimately changing the political map of the British Isles in ways that would last for centuries. We'll explore those campaigns in detail shortly, but first, Let's take a closer look at the individual sons, starting with the one who was probably the most important to the army's success, despite or perhaps because of his physical limitations. Let's talk about Ivar the Boneless. Ivar stands out among his brothers for one simple reason. While they were warriors, he was a general. While they thought in terms of individual combat and battlefield glory, he thought in terms of campaigns, supply lines, political maneuvering, and long-term strategy. The saga describes him as having been born with bones so weak he couldn't stand. Some versions say he had to be carried everywhere on a shield or in a litter. This should have been a death sentence in the violent world of Viking warriors, but Ivar compensated for his physical limitations with an intellect that made him, as his father had said, the most dangerous of all the brothers. Whether the boneless epithet referred to a literal medical condition or was metaphorical, we'll probably never know. What we do know is that the historical Ivar, the one who appears in contemporary chronicles, was an incredibly successful military leader who commanded the respect and loyalty of thousands of warriors. He was the architect of the Great Heathen Army's strategy. When the army took York, it was Ivar who chose to fortify and hold it, rather than just looting and moving on. When they faced superior English forces, it was Ivar who devised the tactics that won the day. When they dealt with English kings, it was often Ivar who negotiated, playing rulers off against each other, exploiting divisions and weaknesses. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle names Ivar, along with his brothers Halfdan and Ubba, as the leaders of the Great Heathen Army. But contemporary and near-contemporary sources often single Ivar out as the most important. The Irish annals refer to him as Imar and describe him as king of the Northmen of all Ireland and Britain, which, if accurate, suggests he achieved a level of power and authority exceptional even by Viking standards. After the conquest of York, Ivar led the army against the neighbouring kingdoms. In 869 they returned to East Anglia, and here occurred one of the most famous incidents of the Viking invasions, the death of King Edmund. Edmund was the king of East Anglia, the same kingdom that had provided horses to the Vikings back in 865. The Vikings now demanded tribute from Edmund. When he refused, they attacked. Edmund's forces were defeated, and Edmund himself was captured. What happened next depends on which source you believe. Christian sources, particularly those written shortly after the events, portray Edmund as a martyr. They say the Vikings demanded he renounce his Christian faith, and when he refused, they tortured and killed him. The martyrology of St. Edmund says he was tied to a tree and shot full of arrows, then beheaded. Edmund was canonized, becoming St. Edmund, and his cult became important in medieval England. The Viking perspective, as recorded in later sources, is different. These sources say Edmund died in battle, or was executed as a defeated enemy king, with no particular religious significance attached. Whatever the truth, Edmund's death had consequences. His martyrdom became a rallying point for English resistance to the Vikings, a symbol of Christian piety versus pagan brutality. But in the immediate term, it didn't help East Anglia, which fell completely under Viking control. Ivar now controlled York and large parts of Northumbria plus East Anglia. That's two of England's major kingdoms, with only Mercia and Wessex remaining independent, and both of those would soon feel the weight of the Great Heathen Army. But around 870, Ivar disappears from the English chronicles. He's just suddenly not mentioned anymore as a leader of the army in England. Where did he go? The Irish annals provide a clue. Around the same time, a Viking leader named Imar appears in Ireland, and most historians believe this is the same person as Ivar. He seems to have left England and focused his attention on Ireland and Scotland. In 870, Imar, along with another Viking leader named Olaf the White, besieged and captured Dumbarton Rock, the capital of the Kingdom of Strathclyde, in what's now Scotland. They took the fortress after a 4-month siege and returned to Dublin with a huge haul of captives and plunder. Ivar apparently became king of Dublin at some point, ruling over the Viking settlement there. He continued to raid and fight in Ireland until his death in 873, according to the Irish annals. The annals of Ulster record that he died of a sudden and horrible disease, which some scholars have speculated might have been related to whatever condition gave him his boneless epithet, if that was indeed a physical rather than metaphorical description. Ivar died, but his legacy lived on. The dynasty he founded, the Uí-Emer, would rule in Dublin, York, and the islands around Britain for generations. His descendants would play crucial roles in British and Irish politics for over a century. There's a burial mound at Repton in Derbyshire, England, discovered in the 1980s. It contains the remains of a Viking warrior of very high status, surrounded by the bones of over 250 other individuals. Some scholars have speculated this might be Ivar's grave, as the Great Heathen Army is known to have spent a winter at Repton, and the burial date seems roughly right. But without DNA evidence definitively linking the remains to Ragnar's family, it remains speculation. What's not speculation is that Ivar the Boneless was one of the most successful Viking leaders in history, a man who, despite physical limitations, or perhaps partially because of them, developed the strategic brilliance to conquer kingdoms and found a dynasty that would last for generations. But Ivar wasn't the only son of Ragnar to achieve great things. While he was conquering England and Ireland, his brother Bjorn was planning an even more audacious adventure, one that would take Vikings farther from home than they'd ever gone before. Let's follow Bjorn Ironside to the Mediterranean. While Ivar was making his name in England, Bjorn Ironside was pursuing his own path to glory, and it led him far to the south, into waters no Viking had sailed before. In 859, roughly 6 years before the Great Heathen Army invaded England, Bjorn, along with another Viking chieftain named Halfdan, assembled a fleet. The sources vary on the exact number of ships, ranging from 62 to over 100, but let's go with the more conservative estimate. That's still a substantial force, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 warriors. Their target? The Mediterranean. Now you have to understand what a bold, even crazy idea this was. The Mediterranean was far from Scandinavia, thousands of miles away. To get there, Vikings would have to sail down the Atlantic coast of Europe, past Francia, past the Iberian Peninsula, through the Strait of Gibraltar, into an entirely different maritime world. The Mediterranean was the territory of the Byzantine Empire, the Umayyad Caliphate, and various Italian city-states. These were sophisticated, wealthy, militarized societies with navies of their own. The Vikings would be operating far from any base, far from any friendly territory, in completely unfamiliar waters. It was exactly the sort of challenge Bjorn couldn't resist. The expedition started by raiding along the coast of what's now Spain and Portugal. They attacked Galicia and Asturias in northern Spain, but found the resistance too strong and moved on. Sailing south, they raided the Muslim territories of Al-Andalus, the Islamic kingdom that controlled most of the Iberian Peninsula. The Muslims were not unprepared. They had coastal defenses, and they managed to capture 2 of Bjorn's ships that had scouted ahead of the main fleet. When they examined these ships, they found them already full of treasure and captives, suggesting the Vikings had been very successful in their raids. But Bjorn pressed on. He sailed through the Strait of Gibraltar, that narrow passage between Europe and Africa, and entered the Mediterranean. No Viking fleet had done this before. They were in completely new territory now, and every coast was a potential target. First, they hit the North African coast, landing at a place called Naka, near modern-day Morocco. The local forces put up minimal resistance and fled. The Vikings plundered freely for about a week. They captured what they called blue men, probably black Africans who had been brought north by Arab slave traders. The Vikings found them so exotic, they kept some as slaves themselves, eventually selling them in Ireland. From Africa, the fleet sailed north to Francia, raiding along the southern coast of what's now France. They captured and looted several towns. Then they sailed to the Balearic Islands, those Mediterranean islands off the coast of Spain, raiding there as well. But Bjorn's most famous exploit, the one that would become legendary, occurred in Italy. According to William of Jumièges, a Norman chronicler writing in the 11th century, Bjorn and Halfdan had a plan. They wanted to attack Rome itself. Rome, the ancient capital, the seat of the Pope, one of the wealthiest cities in Europe. If they could sack Rome, their names would be remembered forever. The problem was that Rome was well inland, protected by walls and by the armies of the Papal States. A direct assault would be difficult at best. So they came up with a trick. The Vikings sailed up the coast of Italy until they came to a walled city called Luni in Tuscany. Now, Bjorn and Halfdan allegedly thought this was Rome. It wasn't. Rome is much farther south. But from the sea, one Italian walled city might look much like another, especially if you'd never been there before. Unable to breach the walls, they devised a ruse. Halfdan sent messengers to the bishop of the city with a sad tale. Their leader, Bjorn, was deathly ill and had converted to Christianity on his deathbed. He wished to receive last rites and be buried in consecrated ground within the city. The bishop, moved by this story of a dying pagan embracing the true faith, agreed. Bjorn was brought into the city on a litter, accompanied by a small honor guard of Vikings who were ostensibly mourning their fallen leader. Once inside the church, Bjorn leaped from his stretcher, very much alive, and the mourners drew their weapons. In the resulting chaos, they opened the city gates for their companions waiting outside. The Vikings sacked Luni, taking everything of value. When they were later told that this wasn't actually Rome, Halfdan was supposedly so disappointed that he ordered every man in Luni killed. Whether this massacre actually happened is debatable. Medieval chroniclers loved dramatic, violent stories, but the tale of the feigned death and the deception became legendary. The story of this particular trick appears in multiple sources and is attributed to different Viking leaders across different raids. It became such a famous tale that later Norman leaders, descendants of Vikings who had settled in France, would use variations of the same ruse in their own campaigns. It seems to have become a greatest hit story, repeated and embellished over time. After looting Luni, the Vikings sailed down the coast to Pisa, sacking that city as well, then possibly inland to Florence. Some sources claim they raided even farther into the Mediterranean, possibly reaching Greece or even Alexandria in Egypt, but these claims are harder to verify. What we know for certain is that the fleet eventually turned homeward, sailing back through the Strait of Gibraltar in 861 or 862, about 2 to 3 years after they'd left Scandinavia. But the return journey was costly. The Umayyad fleet was waiting for them in the strait. The Arabs knew the Vikings would have to come back this way eventually, and they'd prepared a trap. Of the 62 ships that had entered the Mediterranean, only about 20 escaped the ambush. The Vikings lost possibly 2/3 of their force. Still, those who made it back came home with incredible wealth and equally incredible stories. They'd sailed farther than any Vikings before them. They'd raided the Mediterranean, attacked cities in multiple countries, and returned alive to tell the tale. Bjorn's reputation was made. He became known as Bjorn Ironside, supposedly because his flanks were so strong in battle they seemed made of iron. Whether this was literal, suggesting he was incredibly difficult to wound, or metaphorical, suggesting indomitable strength and resilience, the name stuck. According to the sagas, Bjorn eventually returned to Scandinavia and became a king. He's said to have ruled over Sweden, possibly founding the Munsur dynasty. He's even credited with establishing Uppsala, though this is almost certainly legendary, Uppsala being much older. There's a burial mound on the Swedish island of Munsur that's traditionally identified as Bjorn's grave, though there's no archaeological evidence confirming this. The mound has never been properly excavated, so the question remains open. What's certain is that Bjorn Ironside's Mediterranean expedition was one of the most remarkable Viking voyages ever undertaken. It demonstrated the incredible range and audacity of Viking raiders, and it added immensely to the legend of Ragnar's sons. While Bjorn was conquering the Mediterranean and Ivar was conquering England, what about the other brothers? Let's turn our attention to Sigurd, Hvitserk, and Ubbe. Sigurd Snake-in-the-Eye, the brother with the distinctive mark in his eye, is a more shadowy figure in the historical record, but the sagas give us a reasonably detailed account of his life. The mark in his eye, the image of a serpent biting its tail, was said to have been prophesied by his mother Aslaug before his birth. It connected him symbolically to the Midgard serpent, Jörmungandr, the world serpent of Norse mythology, and to his father's serpent-slaying deed. It was a sign that he was marked for greatness. The sagas tell us that Sigurd participated in the revenge against King Aella alongside his brothers. When they heard of their father's death, Sigurd cut himself deeply in his grief, but this self-inflicted wound healed, and he went on to fight in the conquest of Northumbria. After the wars in England, Sigurd returned to Scandinavia. According to the saga of Ragnar's sons, he became king over several territories, including Zealand, Scania, Halland, and the Danish islands. He's said to have ruled wisely and well. The connection to historical figures here becomes more solid. There was a Danish king named Sigfrid, who co-ruled with another king, possibly named Halfdan, in the 870s. The Frankish annals mention these two kings, and historians generally believe Sigfrid might be the same person as Sigurd Snake-in-the-Eye, the names being variations of the same original Norse name. Sigurd's importance to history comes less from his own deeds and more from his descendants. According to Norse genealogies, Sigurd was the ancestor of a line of Danish kings, including Gorm the Old, Harald Bluetooth, Svein Forkbeard, and eventually Canute the Great, who would rule over a North Sea empire including England, Denmark, and Norway in the early 11th century. If these genealogies are accurate, and that's a significant if, then Sigurd Snake-in-the-Eye's bloodline shaped the political history of Scandinavia and England for generations. Modern Danish monarchs claim descent from this line, making Sigurd, theoretically, an ancestor of Denmark's current royal family. Sigurd reportedly died in 887, though the circumstances of his death aren't recorded. Unlike many of his brothers, he seems to have died of natural causes or illness rather than in battle, which probably means he lived to a reasonably old age by Viking standards. Now let's talk about the confusion surrounding Hvitserk and Halfdan, because here's where the sources get truly tangled. Hvitserk, meaning white shirt, appears in the Norse sagas as one of Ragnar's sons. Halfdan Ragnarsson appears in Anglo-Saxon chronicles as one of the leaders of the Great Heathen Army, and later as King of York. The thing is, Hvitserk is never mentioned in Anglo-Saxon sources, and Halfdan is never mentioned in Norse sagas. Most historians have concluded they must be the same person, with Hvitserk being a nickname for Halfdan. White shirt might have referred to him wearing light-colored clothing, or it might have been metaphorical, possibly suggesting purity or youth or any number of other qualities. Viking nicknames weren't always logical or obvious in their origins. If we accept that Hvitserk and Halfdan are the same person, then we can piece together a reasonable biography. Halfdan Hvitserk was one of the primary leaders of the Great Heathen Army, alongside Ivar and Ubbi. When Ivar left for Ireland around 870, Halfdan became the main commander of the army in England. He led raids against Wessex, the last independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom, though he wasn't able to conquer it. In 871, the Great Heathen Army fought a series of battles against Wessex. At the Battle of Ashdown, Halfdan is specifically mentioned by name in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as one of the Viking commanders. The Saxons, led by King Ethelred and his brother Alfred, who would later become Alfred the Great, won this battle, forcing the Vikings to retreat. This was a rare Viking defeat, and it showed that the Great Heathen Army, formidable as it was, could be beaten. But despite this setback, the Vikings continued their campaigns. They wore down the English kingdoms through sustained pressure, conquering territory, installing puppet rulers, and establishing Viking settlements. By 876, Halfdan controlled much of Northumbria, and he began settling his followers there, distributing land to warriors who would farm it. This was a significant shift from pure raiding to colonization. The Vikings weren't just conquering, they were staying. Halfdan also attempted to establish control over Dublin, possibly trying to reclaim territory his brother Ivar had once held. According to Irish sources, he was killed in 877 at the Battle of Strangford Lough in Ireland, fighting against rival Vikings. The Fair Heathens, as they were called, probably the Viking settlers who had been in Ireland longer, defeated Halfdan's forces. Thor's alternate version of his death from the tale of Ragnar's sons says he went to Gardariki, the Viking name for the regions of what's now Russia, and died there, possibly burned alive. The historical and saga versions of events don't always align. What we can say with confidence is that Halfdan Hvitserk was a major military leader, one of the key figures in the Viking conquest of England, and that he died violently, as befitted a warrior of his status. Herby, or Ubba in Anglo-Saxon sources, is mentioned in contemporary chronicles, making him one of the more historically certain of Ragnar's sons. He's named alongside Ivar and Halfdan as a leader of the Great Heathen Army. Ubbi participated in the conquest of York, the subjugation of East Anglia, and the subsequent campaigns in England. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, he was killed in battle in 878 at Sinwit in Devon. The English forces, led by a local leader named Odda, defeated the Vikings in a battle that's sometimes called the Battle of Sinwit. Contemporary sources describe this as a significant English victory. The Vikings lost their war banner, which the English believed had magical properties, and Ubbi himself was slain along with 840 of his men, according to the Chronicle's probably inflated count. Ubbi's death came at a crucial moment. The same year, Alfred the Great defeated the main Viking army led by Guthrum at the Battle of Edington, turning the tide of the war. The Viking conquest of England was halted, and a peace treaty resulted in the establishment of the Danelaw, a division of England between Anglo-Saxon and Viking-controlled territories. So the sons of Ragnar, in the end, had mixed fortunes. Ivar founded a dynasty and died as a king. Bjorn became legendary through his audacious raids and possibly ruled in Sweden. Sigurd became a king in Denmark and sired a royal line. Halfdan Ragnarsson conquered much of Northumbria but died in battle in Ireland. Ubbi fell fighting in England. Taken together, their achievements were extraordinary. They led the largest Viking invasion force in history. They conquered multiple English kingdoms. They established settlements and political structures that would last for generations. They proved themselves worthy of their father's legendary name. But let's step back and look at the broader impact of what they did. The Great Heathen Army wasn't just a Viking raid. It was a turning point in English history. When the Great Heathen Army landed in 865, England was divided into several kingdoms: Northumbria in the north, East Anglia in the east, Mercia in the Midlands, and Wessex in the south. These kingdoms were often at war with each other, which made them vulnerable to external threats. The Vikings exploited these divisions brilliantly. They would make peace with one kingdom, then use it as a base to attack another. They would install puppet rulers who would provide supplies and support. They moved quickly, using the horses they'd acquired in East Anglia to march faster than English armies could respond. The campaign followed a pattern: arrive, make peace if necessary, overwinter, then attack. The English kingdoms, used to seasonal Viking raids that came in summer and left in autumn, were unprepared for a Viking force that stayed year-round, that built fortifications, that planned long-term campaigns. York fell in 866, giving the Vikings a major urban centre and a defensible position in the north. The capture of York was particularly significant because it had been the capital of Northumbria, and it would become the Viking city of Jorvik, a major trading centre for the next 2 centuries. East Anglia fell in 869 with the defeat and death of King Edmund. The Vikings now controlled the entire eastern coast of England and had a secure base of operations. Mercia, the powerful Midlands kingdom, was the next target. The Vikings invaded in 874, and King Burgred was forced to flee to Rome. The Vikings installed a puppet ruler named Ceolwulf, who agreed to provide them with supplies and support whenever they asked. By 874, only Wessex remained independent, and it was under immense pressure. The Vikings launched multiple campaigns against King Alfred, trying to complete their conquest of England. But Alfred proved to be a much tougher opponent than the other English kings. He reorganized his army, built a network of fortified towns called burhs, and developed a navy to counter Viking ships. Most importantly, he didn't give up, even when the Vikings seemed to be winning. In 878, after a particularly dire period when Alfred was forced to hide in the marshes of Somerset, he rallied his forces and won a decisive victory at the Battle of Edington. The Viking army, now led by a chieftain named Guthrum, since Ivar had left, and Ubbi and Halfdan were fighting elsewhere, was defeated. Alfred forced Guthrum to convert to Christianity and agree to a peace treaty that divided England. The Vikings would control the north and east, the region that became known as the Danelaw, while Alfred would rule Wessex and the west. This arrangement would last with modifications for generations. The Great Heathen Army's campaign lasted from 865 to around 878, about 13 years of sustained military action. It fundamentally changed England. Large parts of the country were now under Viking control, and these areas would be settled by Scandinavian farmers, traders, and craftsmen. The Danelaw developed its own character, a fusion of Anglo-Saxon and Norse cultures. Place names in this region still reflect Viking influence. Names ending in by, Thorpe, Thwaite are all of Norse origin. The legal system incorporated Norse customs. The population became mixed Anglo-Scandinavian. Even after the English kings eventually reconquered the Danelaw in the 10th century, the Viking influence remained. English absorbed hundreds of Norse words. Cultural practices blended. In many ways, the England that would emerge after the Viking Age was a hybrid culture. Neither purely Anglo-Saxon nor purely Norse, but something new, and it all started with the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok seeking vengeance for their father's death. Whether Ragnar himself was real or legendary, his sons certainly were, and they changed the course of history. So here we are at the question that's been lurking beneath everything we've discussed. Did Ragnar Lothbrok actually exist? The honest answer is, we don't know for certain, and we probably never will. Let's look at the evidence for his existence. We have the Frankish annals mentioning a Viking leader named Ragnar, who attacked Paris in 845 and was paid off with silver. We have the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentioning Viking raids and leaders during this period, though not Ragnar by name. We have Irish annals mentioning various Viking activities. We have, in short, evidence for Viking activity during the period when Ragnar supposedly lived, and evidence for some Viking leaders whose names might possibly be Ragnar or variations thereof. But we don't have contemporary sources that say Ragnar Lothbrok, son of Sigurd Ring, killed a giant serpent and had 5 famous sons. The detailed information about Ragnar comes from sources written hundreds of years after he supposedly lived, and these sources are literary works, sagas meant to entertain and edify, not historical chronicles meant to record facts. But here's the thing, his sons are historical. Ivar, Bjorn, Halfdan, Ubbe, these aren't legendary figures from the distant past. They appear in contemporary chronicles. Archaeological evidence, like coins minted in their names, confirms their existence. The Great Heathen Army definitely invaded England in 865, and it was definitely led by people who claimed to be Ragnar's sons. So if the sons existed, doesn't that suggest the father did too? Maybe. Or maybe son of Ragnar Lothbrok was a title or claim these warriors made to boost their prestige. Maybe they were claiming descent from a legendary figure rather than a historical one, the way Alexander the Great claimed descent from Zeus. Maybe some of them were actual brothers, and others were adopted or claimed brotherhood as a political alliance. Viking society was flexible about family relationships. Adoption was common. Brotherhood could be sworn between unrelated warriors. Son of didn't always mean biological descent. It could mean student, follower, or successor. The most likely scenario, according to many historians, is that there was a historical Viking leader, or possibly several leaders, whose exploits formed the basis for the Ragnar legend. This person or persons raided Francia, possibly attacked Paris, probably raided England, and likely had sons who became famous warriors in their own right. Over time, as the stories were told and retold, the historical figure absorbed the characteristics and deeds of other heroes. He became conflated with legendary dragon slayers and associated with mythological elements. The line between history and legend blurred, then disappeared entirely. By the time the sagas were written down in the 13th century, Ragnar Lothbrok had become a composite figure, part history, part legend, part myth. He represented the idealized Viking warrior king, a figure who combined all the virtues the Norse admired: courage, cunning, ambition, loyalty to kin, and defiance in the face of death. The question of whether Ragnar really existed might be less important than what his story tells us. The sagas preserved these tales because they meant something to the people who told them and heard them. They embodied values, illustrated cultural ideals, and provided a connection to a heroic past. In a sense, Ragnar Lothbrok is real in the way that Robin Hood is real, or King Arthur. There might have been historical figures behind the legends, but what matters isn't the historical kernel of truth. What matters is the story itself, the way it was told and retold, the impact it had on culture and imagination. And Ragnar's story, true or false, real or legendary, has had a remarkable impact that continues even now. In recent years, Ragnar Lothbrok has become more famous than he's been at any time since the Middle Ages, and this is largely due to one television series, Vikings. which aired from 2013 to 2020 on the History Channel. The show, created by Michael Hurst, presented Ragnar as a complex, ambitious farmer who rises to become a king. Travis Fimmel's portrayal of Ragnar as a curious, cunning, sometimes cruel but ultimately sympathetic figure introduced millions of viewers to Viking culture and the legends surrounding this figure. Vikings took considerable liberties with the historical and legendary sources. It compressed timelines, invented characters, changed relationships, and generally shaped the story to fit modern television narrative conventions. Lagertha, for instance, is presented as Bjorn's mother and Ragnar's great love, when in the sources she's from a completely different tradition and Bjorn is consistently said to be Aslaug's son. But the show was never claiming to be a documentary. It was using the legendary material as inspiration for a fictional narrative, the way Shakespeare used historical sources for his plays. And in doing so, it introduced a new generation to these stories. The impact was significant. Tourism to Viking-associated sites increased. Renewed interest in Norse history and archaeology followed. Academic conferences on Viking Age studies saw increased attendance. The show sparked conversations about Norse mythology, Viking warfare, and early medieval history that reached far beyond academic circles. Other media have picked up on the Ragnar legend as well. Video games like Assassin's Creed Valhalla feature references to Ragnar and his sons. Historical fiction novels have been written about the period. The fascination with Vikings in general, and Ragnar specifically, shows no signs of diminishing. Why does this legendary figure from 12 centuries ago still resonate? Perhaps it's the combination of elements: the larger-than-life hero, the famous sons, the dramatic death, the historical impact. Perhaps it's the way the Viking Age represents a time of adventure, exploration, and change. Perhaps it's simply that the stories are good, full of the drama, violence, and heroism that make for compelling narratives. Whatever the reason, Ragnar Lothbrok has secured his place not just in medieval legend, but in modern popular culture. He's become an icon, a symbol of the Viking Age, instantly recognizable even to people who know nothing else about Norse history. And in a way, this is fitting. The Vikings themselves were master storytellers. They preserved their history through oral tradition, through poetry and saga, through stories told around fires in longhouses during the long Scandinavian winters. They valued the skalds, the poets who could memorialize deeds and preserve names for posterity. Ragnar Lothbrok, whether he was real or legendary, has been remembered. His name has been preserved. The stories about him continue to be told in new forms and new media, but with the same essential elements: bravery, cunning, ambition, loyalty, and defiance in the face of death. In the end, that might be more than any historical Viking could have hoped for: to be remembered, to be talked about, to have one's name spoken with respect 1,000 years after death. By that standard, Ragnar Lothbrok, whoever he really was, achieved immortality. Let's step back and consider what the story of Ragnar and his sons actually means, what their legacy is, both historically and culturally. From a historical perspective, the impact is clear and measurable. The Great Heathen Army changed the political map of England. The establishment of the Danelaw created a Scandinavian presence in Britain that would last for centuries. The cultural fusion that resulted enriched both Norse and Anglo-Saxon society. The legal systems of the Danelaw incorporated Norse concepts of justice and property rights. The English language absorbed Norse vocabulary. Place names across northern and eastern England still reflect this Viking heritage. Archaeological sites throughout the former Danelaw show mixed Anglo-Scandinavian cultural material. Norse jewelry styles adapted by English craftsmen, English pottery techniques adopted by Norse settlers, a blending and fusion of cultures. The Viking kingdoms in Dublin, York, and other cities became important trading centres, connecting the North Atlantic world with continental Europe. The descendants of the Great Heathen Army's warriors would continue to play important roles in British and Irish politics for generations. Ivar's dynasty, the Uí Ímair, would rule in Dublin and at various times in York until the late 10th century. The Viking Kingdom of York wouldn't finally fall to English control until 954, nearly a century after the Great Heathen Army first arrived. And even after the Viking kingdoms fell, the influence remained. When Svein Forkbeard of Denmark, a descendant of Sigurd Snake-in-the-Eye according to the genealogies, conquered England in 1013, it was in some ways a continuation of what the sons of Ragnar had started. His son Canute would rule a North Sea empire that included England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden, uniting regions that had been connected by Viking raids and settlements for 2 centuries. From a cultural perspective, the legacy of Ragnar and his sons is equally significant. The sagas that preserve their stories are literary masterpieces, examples of medieval Scandinavian narrative art at its finest. These weren't just histories, they were explorations of themes like fate, honor, family loyalty, and the relationship between humans and the divine. The figure of Ragnar embodies contradictions. He's both historical and legendary, both heroic and flawed, both a model to emulate and a warning about the dangers of ambition and pride. The sagas don't present him as perfect. He makes mistakes, he can be cruel. He's led by passion as well as wisdom. He's human in a way that purely legendary heroes often aren't. His sons are similarly complex. Ivar is brilliant but ruthless, possibly disabled but dangerous, strategic but capable of extreme cruelty. Bjorn is bold but perhaps reckless, brave but not always wise. Sigurd is marked by prophecy but doesn't seem to achieve as much as his brothers. These are rounded characters, not cardboard cutouts. The stories preserve a worldview, a way of thinking about honor, courage, fate, and death that was particular to Viking Age Scandinavia. The emphasis on reputation and being remembered after death, the idea that dying well is as important as living well, the acceptance of fate while still striving to achieve glory, these concepts permeate the sagas, and they've resonated through the centuries. Every age that has encountered these stories has found something in them worth preserving and retelling. Medieval Icelanders found models of heroic behavior. Victorian scholars found examples of Germanic racial purity, though thankfully we've moved past that particular interpretation. Modern audiences find complex, morally ambiguous characters dealing with themes of power, loyalty, and legacy. The stories of Ragnar and his sons have survived because they're good stories, well told, full of memorable characters and dramatic events. But they've also survived because they speak to something fundamental about the human experience, the desire to be remembered, to make a mark on the world, to achieve something that will outlast our brief lives. In that sense, Ragnar Lothbrok, legendary or historical, has achieved exactly what he set out to do. His name is still spoken, his deeds are still recounted, his sons' exploits are still studied. Whether he was one man or an amalgamation of several, whether he died in a snake pit or some other way, whether he wore hairy breeches or that's just a good story, doesn't really matter. What matters is that the legend endures. As we come to the end of our journey through the story of Ragnar Lothbrok and his sons, perhaps the most remarkable thing is that we're still telling this story at all. 1,200 years have passed since Ragnar supposedly sailed the seas and raided the coasts of Europe. Empires have risen and fallen. Languages have evolved beyond recognition. The world has changed in ways no Viking could have imagined. And yet, here we are, still talking about a legendary warrior and his equally legendary sons. The line between history and legend, which seemed so important at the beginning of our tale, has blurred into something less distinct, but perhaps more meaningful. Yes, it matters whether Ragnar was real, whether the events described in the sagas actually happened. Historians will continue to debate these questions, and occasionally new archaeological discoveries will shed light on one aspect or another of the Viking Age. But the stories themselves have a truth that transcends historical accuracy. They tell us about the values, fears, and aspirations of the people who created them. They preserve a window into a vanished culture, a way of looking at the world that's both alien and familiar. The Vikings valued courage, but also cunning. They admired strength, but also wisdom. They believed in fate, but also in making your own destiny. They accepted that death was inevitable, but insisted that how you faced death mattered. All of these ideas are embedded in the stories of Ragnar and his sons. Modern retellings, whether in television, literature, or games, continue to find new ways to explore these themes. Each generation that encounters these stories interprets them through its own lens, finds its own meanings, draws its own lessons. Ragnar, with his clever tactics and his multiple wives and his dramatic death, remains a figure of fascination. Ivar, overcoming physical limitations through sheer force of will and intellect, resonates with modern ideas about disability and ability. Bjorn, sailing into unknown waters in search of glory, embodies the spirit of adventure. The other sons, each with their own stories, add depth and complexity to the narrative. Together, they created a legacy that lasted far beyond their lifetimes, assuming they even had lifetimes in the historical sense. They changed the map of England. They founded kingdoms and dynasties. They became legends. And legends, in their own way, are as real and as powerful as historical facts. They shape how we think about the past. They influence how we imagine ourselves and our possibilities. They connect us across centuries to people whose lives were vastly different from ours, but whose fundamental concerns, their desire for meaning, for remembrance, for legacy, are instantly recognizable. So whether Ragnar Lothbrok truly existed matters less than you might think. What matters is the story, the telling and retelling of it, the way it's been preserved and passed down, the impact it's had on culture and imagination. The Vikings believed that there were two deaths, the first when your body died, and the second when your name was spoken for the last time. By that standard, Ragnar Lothbrok and his sons are still very much alive. Their names are still spoken, their deeds are still recounted, their legacy endures. And on quiet nights like this one, when the modern world seems far away and the past feels close, it's easy to imagine them. Ragnar in his hairy breeches facing the serpent, Ivar being carried into battle on his shield, Bjorn sailing through the Strait of Gibraltar into unknown waters, all of the sons gathering to avenge their father, swearing oaths that would echo through history. They lived in a brutal age, made brutal choices, and met brutal ends as befitted warriors of that time, but they also lived fully, boldly, without compromise. They reached for glory and, in their own way, achieved it. The North Sea still washes against the shores of Scandinavia, just as it did 1,200 years ago. The ruins of York still stand. The burial mounds of Sweden still dot the landscape. And somewhere in all of this, in the physical remnants and the preserved stories, the spirits of these legendary warriors endure. If this tale has given you something to think about as you drift towards sleep, then it's done its job. The Vikings told stories around fires in longhouses to pass the long northern nights. We're doing much the same thing, in a different time and a different way. So rest now. Let the images wash over you. Longships on grey seas, warriors with bright swords, kings in great halls, and a legendary father and his sons who changed the world. Whether they were real or not, their story is true in the ways that matter. Sleep well, and may you dream of distant shores and ancient times, of courage and cunning, of the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok sailing toward their destiny. And if you enjoyed this journey through Viking legend and history, remember to like the video and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what aspect of this story fascinated you most, or what legendary figure you'd like to hear about next. Until next time, rest well.